In every person's life, there come moments when they have to face emotional wounds. Some of them leave barely noticeable scars, while others gape open, sensitive to the slightest touch. Society often teaches us to be strong, to move forward without looking back, and to put the interests of others above our own. But what happens when the only path to progress lies through stopping and healing? According to many experts in the field of personal growth, to achieve emotional healing, it is necessary to recognize oneself as a priority. This is not a manifestation of selfishness, not a fleeting whim, and not an excuse to ignore the suffering of others. On the contrary, it is the foundation of a fulfilling life. When we heal and learn to truly love ourselves, we become an inexhaustible source of well-being for both ourselves and those around us. However, on the path to this state, a serious obstacle arises: internal resistance. From childhood, we are taught to consider self-care as secondary and satisfying our own needs as an act of arrogance. We feel guilty when we say no, when we avoid what causes pain, when we make choices in our favor. This guilt becomes a barrier that keeps us in destructive behavioral patterns. Our thoughts shape our reality. But what reality do we create when we put ourselves at the end of the priority list, sacrificing ourselves in the name of duty, love, or loyalty? Are we really showing responsibility and love, or are we simply prolonging the suffering that will eventually engulf us? What will happen if we continue to ignore our own needs and emotional state? What will be the consequences of such neglect for us and for those around us? The answers to these questions may be unexpected and make us think about the need to reconsider our life priorities. Imagine years spent holding a rope tightly in your hands. At first, its weight seems insignificant, but gradually the tension increases. The muscles begin to ache, the skin becomes irritated, and strength inexorably leaves you. You continue to cling to the rope, obeying the belief that letting go means showing weakness. But with each day, the pain becomes more unbearable, until one day the realization comes: the only way to get rid of the torment is to unclench your fingers and let it fall. Prioritizing your own emotional healing is that very act of liberation, a rejection of an unbearable burden. This is not a call to abandon loved ones or neglect your responsibilities. It is about recognizing the fact that you cannot give your best when you are exhausted, when you are burdened by unresolved emotional wounds, when your care for others grows out of a deficit of love for yourself. But why is it so difficult for us to take this step? First of all, we are paralyzed by fear. Fear of judgment, fear of being rejected, fear of not being good enough. Louise, known for her works on self-development, spoke a lot about the healing power of self-love, but not in its superficial manifestation. It is not just about mechanically repeating positive affirmations in front of a mirror, but about deep inner work, about a courageous confrontation with one's own dark sides, about recognizing the stories we tell ourselves, and about consciously rewriting these narratives. Every thought that we cultivate in our minds has a direct impact on our lives. If we constantly tell ourselves that we do not deserve rest, that we have no right to put ourselves first, that being a good person means sacrificing ourselves, then this is the reality that will be created by us. We will live in a state of constant guilt, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. But there is an alternative path. We can consciously change the narrative, make a decision here and now that our healing is a priority task, that we are worthy of peace and love, which begins with ourselves. And when we make this decision, when we sincerely dedicate ourselves to our own well-being, something truly magical happens. The world around us begins to change. Toxic relationships lose their power, healthy connections become stronger, new opportunities open up, and life becomes easier and more joyful. This happens because we no longer act out of a need for recognition from others, but proceed from inner fullness and love for ourselves, which does not depend on external circumstances. But do not think that the path to healing is strewn with roses. It is rather a thorny road, requiring courage to look into the darkest corners of your soul. You will have to face the truth that we have carefully avoided. Let go of what has long been a source of pain, even if this sick seems familiar and dear. And yet every step, every overcome milestone brings us closer to a life full of authenticity, freedom, and self-realization. Louise Hay left us an invaluable legacy of wisdom. True transformation begins with the transformation of our thoughts. And while this idea may seem simple, its impact on our lives is enormous. When we learn to speak to ourselves with love and compassion, when we allow ourselves a break without feeling guilty, when we prioritize ourselves, everything around us begins to find harmony. It is then that we realize a simple but important truth. It is impossible to heal by forgetting about ourselves. Emotional healing is not a final point that can be reached in an instant, but rather a continuous journey, a constant evolution. On this path, we realize that it is not enough to simply put ourselves first. It is important to understand where our emotional wounds originate. Often the pain we carry within us does not originate in the present, but in unresolved conflicts of the past, in the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. Louise Hay emphasized that beliefs learned in childhood can become serious emotional blocks in adulthood. From a very early age, we absorb messages about love, self-esteem, and self-worth. If we grew up in an atmosphere where sacrifice was considered the highest expression of kindness, we are likely to feel guilty when putting our own interests first. If we were taught that our value is determined by external recognition, we are doomed to an endless search for approval, even at the expense of our own well-being. Realizing the need for change contains enormous power. Simply acknowledging the problem opens the gates to transformation for us. We are not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, not bound by the chains of a history written by someone else's hand. We have the opportunity to rewrite our own destiny, even if it requires rethinking established beliefs. However, on this path, many encounter an unexpected obstacle: resistance from others. When we put our own interests first, when we learn to say no to everything that harms us, when we stop sacrificing our peace of mind to please others, there are inevitably those who do not understand this. They are used to our willingness to please, to the fact that we are always available and ready to put their needs above our own. Their reaction can range from disapproval and surprise to outright anger. And then we are faced with a difficult question. Are we willing to sacrifice certain relationships in order to gain emotional freedom? The answer to it is not always obvious. Sometimes we desperately cling to relationships that cause us pain, out of fear of loneliness. We continue to participate in toxic interactions because uncertainty and the unknown seem even more frightening to us. But Louise Hay reminds us of an important truth. It all starts with our relationship with ourselves. If we build a solid foundation of self-love, we will no longer depend on other people's recognition and approval to feel our own completeness. Prioritizing yourself, however, does not mean isolation or refusing to communicate with other people. It is not about living in a vacuum and denying our need for social connections, but about building relationships based on a sense of internal fulfillment, not need. It is important to surround ourselves with people who respect our path of development and understand that taking care of ourselves is not selfishness, but a fundamental obligation. And here another key question arises. How to start this process. Healing is not only a mental or emotional exercise, but also a physical one. Our body stores memories, tensions, and pains that reflect our inner state. Louise Hay spoke about the power of positive affirmations, but also emphasized the importance of listening to the signals that our body sends us. Stress, anxiety, and chronic exhaustion often indicate that we are ignoring our basic needs. When we allow ourselves to rest, when we give ourselves the right to enjoy life without feeling guilty, when we provide ourselves with space to express emotions without judging ourselves, changes occur at a biological level. Our energy is transformed, health improves, and the mind becomes clearer. After all, the body and mind are inextricably linked and form a single whole. This leads us to another crucial aspect of healing: forgiveness. Many people carry a burden of guilt and resentment that prevents them from moving forward. They feel stuck in the past, reliving the pain of past events over and over again. But as Louise Hay said, holding on to resentment is like drinking poison, hoping that the offender will suffer. Forgiveness is not a gift to those who have hurt us, but an act of liberation for ourselves. Forgiving ourselves for those moments when we betrayed ourselves, settled for less than we deserve, and belittled ourselves to meet other people's expectations. This is an important part of the process because it is impossible to change the past, but we can change our attitude towards it. Here is where many experience fear, as healing involves facing unpleasant emotions, painful memories, and truths we would rather avoid. It requires an open look at our wounds, rather than hiding them under a mask of distractions. But behind this fear lies a priceless treasure: freedom. Freedom to live according to our true values, freedom to make choices without fear, freedom to love ourselves unconditionally, freedom from the need for approval, freedom from the burden of the past, and the opportunity to create a life that aligns with our true essence. In the process of prioritizing ourselves for emotional healing, we confront a reality that we rarely analyze: how we interpret our own suffering. We have been taught to perceive pain as something to be avoided, as an enemy to be suppressed or ignored. But what if pain is not a punishment, but a compass? Louise Hay spoke about how our suppressed emotions can manifest in the body and in everyday life. Accumulated stress turns into fatigue, anxiety into digestive problems, and resentment into muscle tension. Our bodies are constantly sending us signals, but we rarely take the time to hear them. When we prioritize ourselves, we not only take care of our emotions, but also learn to understand the language of our bodies. Often we ignore fatigue because we have more important things to do. We continue to move forward without thinking about whether our routine is exhausting us. But there comes a moment when the body can no longer withstand such a load and forces us to stop. That is when many feel like failures, because we live in a culture that celebrates productivity and makes us believe that our value is determined by how much we do. In this context, prioritizing oneself is perceived as a weakness, as a way to evade responsibility. But the reality is that self-care is not a luxury, but a necessity. Louise Hay insisted on the importance of self-love as the foundation of any healing process. But this self-love is not just an abstract idea. It must be expressed in concrete actions, being able to say no when something hurts us, leaving places where we are not valued, and allowing ourselves to rest without feeling guilty. And here arises another key point: the relationship between emotional healing and the environment in which we find ourselves. Many try to heal while remaining in an environment that constantly amplifies their wounds, build self-confidence in the midst of people who belittle them, find peace in places where chaos reigns, and prioritize themselves in a circle that condemns them for it. It is like trying to heal a wound while constantly sprinkling it with salt. The environment matters not because we should depend on it, but because it affects our perception of ourselves. Surrounding ourselves with people who respect our path is fundamental. Sometimes this involves making difficult decisions, ending friendships that have become toxic, distancing ourselves from relatives who do not respect our boundaries, and changing the environment when we feel that it is suffocating us. But here many face an unexpected obstacle, the feeling of emptiness that comes after. When we have spent years putting the interests of others above our own, when we have built our identity based on the expectations of others, prioritizing ourselves can seem strange. It is as if we suddenly see ourselves without the roles we are used to playing. This emptiness, although uncomfortable, opens up new opportunities. The opportunity to rediscover who we are, beyond what we do for others. After all, one of the most common traps is to confuse our identity with our connections, to believe that we are only valuable when we are always available, always ready to offer help, and never disappoint anyone. But what happens when we let go of this need for external validation? What remains when we remove all these layers, when we decide to prioritize ourselves and consciously heal our emotional wounds? We enter uncharted territory. We face not only our fears and insecurities, but also the expectations that society has placed on us. From childhood, we are taught that being a good person means sacrificing ourselves for others, that love is synonymous with total giving, and that a person's value is measured by how much they are willing to give. We are shaped to think that self-care is selfish, saying no is an act of coldness, and setting boundaries is a sign of indifference. But what happens when we live by these rules for too long? There comes a moment when we feel exhausted, lose our identity in trying to please everyone, feel responsible for the happiness of others, and at the same time, unable to find our own. We become accustomed to putting our needs last, until one day we realize we've forgotten who we are. Louise spoke of the importance of changing our internal dialogue, of revisiting those beliefs that have limited us for many years. If we grew up believing that our worth depends on what we do for others, we will find it difficult to accept that we deserve love simply for existing. If we were taught that rest is synonymous with laziness, we will feel guilty every time we try to take care of ourselves. Therefore, emotional healing is not just an act of self-care, but a deep process of deconstruction. It's facing all the beliefs that have been imposed on us and asking, is this really true? Does it benefit me to continue believing this? And here arises one of the biggest resistances. When we try to change our minds, it clings to the familiar. Even if the sacrifice causes us suffering, it is still familiar territory. Even if guilt restricts us, it is a feeling we are used to. Even if living for others exhausts us, it is what we have done all our lives. Breaking with these patterns forces us to face the unknown, and the unknown is frightening. But it is the only path to true freedom. When we stop seeking validation from the outside and let go of the need for approval, something incredible happens. We find ourselves. We realize that our existence itself is justification, that we deserve love without proving anything, and that our happiness depends not on how much we give, but on how much we allow ourselves to receive. This process is not linear. Often, when we start to prioritize ourselves, we experience what is known as the rebound effect. We go from having no boundaries to setting rigid and extreme boundaries, from constantly agreeing to everything to refusing any obligations, from constant availability to complete isolation. This is an understandable defense mechanism. After many years of living for others, our first reaction may be complete shutdown. But balance is not in the extremes, but in knowing when it is time to give and when it is time to hold back. Taking a course towards priorities does not mean turning away from our neighbors, but rather realizing that love for oneself and love for others are not mutually exclusive concepts, but rather two sides of the same coin. Only by finding harmony with ourselves can we generously share the best qualities with those around us. And here, many are caught in one of the most difficult tests, the discomfort caused by change. After all, prioritizing often challenges established relationships. If we were previously that person who was always ready to help, then change can cause resistance. There will be those who will feel uncomfortable with our new boundaries, who will try to induce guilt, who will claim that we have changed, as if it were something reprehensible. However, changing is natural, growing is wonderful, and ceasing to put up with what we used to tolerate is not a manifestation of malice, but an act of self-discovery. And yet, even realizing this with our minds, we are tormented by guilt. Guilt for saying no, for not responding to messages instantly, for not being available 24 hours a day, guilt for putting our own well-being above the expectations of others. But guilt is not an error signal, but a sign that we are breaking stereotypes, going beyond expectations, and choosing ourselves for the first time. Louise rightly reminded us that guilt is a learned emotion, not an absolute truth. We have been taught to feel responsible for the well-being of everyone but ourselves. We have been convinced that love is measured by sacrifices and worth by how often we forget about ourselves. But it is worth asking ourselves, do we really want to live like this? Do we really want to carry the burden of expectations that harm us? Do we really want to ignore our own needs, just so as not to bother others? Do we really want to live a life feeling that our well-being should always be in last place? It is impossible to heal by repeating past mistakes. It is impossible to find peace by indulging in destructive relationships. It is impossible to be happy believing that happiness is something to be put off until later. Emotional healing is not an instantaneous process, but a gradual elimination of limitations and acquisition of what strengthens us. It is a path where every small step is important, and every time we make ourselves a priority, when we allow ourselves to rest, enjoy, express our feelings without fear, we move forward. After all, priority is not selfishness, but a manifestation of love for oneself. And without love for oneself, healing is impossible. When talking about emotional healing, we often imagine a serene picture: bubble baths, meditations, motivating phrases, convincing us that everything will be all right. But the reality of healing is different. It's not just positive affirmations in front of the mirror, not just repeating, "I love myself," while ignoring unhealed wounds. Healing is a chaotic process, full of contradictions, ups and downs, moments of clarity that give way to days when it seems all efforts are in vain. It is like a raging river, sweeping everything in its path, making us feel like we are drowning before washing us ashore. And in this process, the daily choice is important. It is not enough to say once, "I will take care of myself," and wait for change. The priority is choosing yourself every day, even when you want to return to old habits. Give in to the temptation to put yourself second, succumb to guilt, and stay where you are unhappy. But what if the world does not seem to understand our decision? After all, healing is often a lonely process. Not because no one loves us, but because not everyone is ready to accept our transformation. There will be those who are uncomfortable with our growth, those who... Society prefers to see us in the role of a person who does not set personal boundaries, is always available, and makes no demands. Herein lies one of the most difficult challenges: resistance from others. When we start to change, our environment is forced to adapt with us. Familiar patterns of behavior collapse, relationships based on our compliance become unstable, and those who benefited from our submissiveness begin to express dissatisfaction. It is at this moment that many abandon their path, as it is not easy to watch close relationships lose their warmth, connections break, and the feeling of guilt gnaws from within, whispering about the wrongness of the chosen direction. However, it is important to realize that we are not losing the relationships themselves, but only those versions of ourselves that no longer correspond to our true essence. Genuine connections will withstand the test of our growth. The people who love us will learn to respect our boundaries, and those who cannot do this were probably never there for us for sincere reasons. Louise Hay often spoke about the importance of self-love. But self-love is not just admiring your reflection in the mirror. It is the willingness to go through the discomfort of change, to allow yourself to grow, even if it means giving up those aspects of life that no longer bring benefit. One of the most difficult stages of this process is learning to let go. Letting go of the need for universal understanding, emotional dependence on those who do not value us, guilt for not always meeting other people's expectations, and the belief that our well-being should come last. By letting go of the old, we free up space for new relationships, new experiences, and a new look at ourselves. And here we are faced with a pressing question: how to deal with the loneliness that inevitably arises when we decide to put our interests first. Often, this entails a reduction in our social circle, evenings when it seems that no one shares our feelings, and the realization that the path we have chosen distances us from familiar and comfortable places. But loneliness is not an enemy, but a valuable ally. It is in silence and solitude that we comprehend our true essence, when nothing distracts us and external noise does not drown out the inner voice. This inner voice can reveal not the most pleasant things, point out those aspects of our personality that we have diligently ignored, and reveal the uncomfortable truth about the life we have lived. But it will also point to our inner strength. Having overcome the stage of loneliness, we discover that we are self-sufficient and do not need constant confirmation of our significance. Our inner world ceases to depend on the number of people around us and begins to be determined by harmony with ourselves. And then the real magic happens. Relationships that truly nourish and enrich us begin to come into our lives. We are no longer satisfied with emotional scraps and do not settle for less than we deserve. The fear of parting with what does not suit us disappears. We become more discerning about our time, energy, and the people we let into our lives. And this, contrary to popular belief, is not selfishness, but a manifestation of self-love in its highest form. On the thorny path of self-discovery and prioritization, you inevitably encounter a bitter truth. We are completely unaccustomed to showing mercy to our own person. Patience towards ourselves is foreign to us. We place on our shoulders an unbearable burden of demands, far exceeding what we would make of our neighbor. In our internal monologues, we unleash a barrage of criticism on ourselves that is unthinkable in communication with people dear to our hearts. Should we stumble, we subject ourselves to merciless mental punishment. If we lack the fortitude to defend our personal boundaries, we indulge in self-flagellation. Even a brief setback in the process of self-improvement plunges us into a pit of guilt. But why are we so cruel to ourselves? The answer lies in the deeply rooted belief that self-love is not an unconditional gift, but a kind of reward that must be earned with blood, sweat, and tears. We have been convinced that we are worthy of good treatment only when we meet certain standards, when we demonstrate high productivity, when our actions are impeccable, when we achieve our goals. However, true emotional healing implies a complete rejection of this worldview. It requires the realization that self-love needs no justification or conditions. Even in the darkest periods of life, we deserve respect, understanding, and leniency. And here we come to the key moment. We need to learn to conduct an internal dialogue in a completely new way. The words we address to ourselves have a tremendous impact on our self-esteem, on our perception of reality, on our ability to recover. If we constantly tell ourselves that we are not good enough, that we never manage to do anything right, that we are haunted by failures, then sooner or later we begin to believe it. Louise Hay spoke about the miraculous power of affirmations, but not as a banal mechanical exercise, but as a powerful tool for reprogramming our consciousness. It's not about mindlessly repeating memorized phrases, but about starting to treat yourself with the same tenderness and compassion that we would show to a friend in trouble. The truth of life is that each of us, walking our own path, is not immune to mistakes and falls. There are times when confidence leaves us, and there is a temptation to return to familiar but outdated patterns of behavior. Instead of indulging in self-flagellation, it is worth asking yourself, what would a person who loves me unconditionally say to me at this very moment? This loving voice would remind us that experiencing negative emotions is natural, that the healing process is not a straight road, and that our value is determined not by our actions, but by our essence. It would remind us that even in moments of confusion, we continue to move forward. However, such changes do not happen instantly. Learning to talk to yourself with love is an art that requires constant practice and awareness. It is necessary to notice the moments when we slide into self-condemnation and consciously choose a softer and more supportive response. At this stage of spiritual growth, an unexpected fear may arise, the fear of losing oneself. After all, if we have defined ourselves throughout our lives through the prism of sacrifice, self-denial, and the pursuit of external approval, then who are we if we stop living that way? Abandoning the image of ourselves that we have created is a frightening prospect. The realization that we do not know who we are outside of our usefulness to others causes anxiety. Acknowledging that our value does not depend on the degree of our dedication can be disconcerting. But it is in this uncertainty that there is enormous potential. The opportunity to rebuild ourselves based on our true essence, to discover what brings us sincere joy, regardless of the expectations of others, to explore our personality, shedding the mask of duty and the habitual role that we have played for years. And in this process of rediscovering ourselves, we often encounter an unexpected phenomenon, the fear of happiness. Paradoxically, many people fear happiness more than suffering. After all, suffering, no matter how painful, is a familiar territory to which we are accustomed. Happiness, on the other hand, is an unexplored space. What if, by allowing ourselves to be happy, we lose everything? What if, having experienced the fullness of life for the first time, we encounter something that will destroy it? What if we realize that we have been content with less than we deserve all our lives? This fear is quite real, and often, without realizing it, we harm ourselves. We convince ourselves that we don't need so much, agree to relationships that don't bring complete satisfaction, and tell ourselves that fullness of life is an unaffordable luxury. Louise Hay wisely reminded us that happiness is not an ephemeral dream available only to the chosen few, and not the result of ideal life circumstances. Happiness is an internal state that requires conscious development, and cultivating it begins with re-evaluating our own priorities. This implies an honest and sometimes painful self-analysis. What factors in our lives constantly poison our existence? What relationships or patterns of behavior no longer benefit us? What habits undermine our well-being? This process entails making difficult decisions because awareness of one's own value no longer allows us to be content with little. This is where many encounter the main obstacle: resistance to change. It's not about a lack of desire to change, but about the fear of letting go of what has served as a refuge, even if it is full of suffering. The familiar, even if it hurts, creates an illusion of security. However, if we strive for healing, we must learn to let go. Letting go doesn't mean devaluing the past, denying the significance of the years lived, or the people who were part of our lives. Letting go means expressing gratitude for the experience, learning from it, and moving forward. It means acknowledging that we deserve more, even if we don't yet know what that is. It means trusting the future, believing that it will bring something better, even if it's not obvious right now. Ultimately, emotional healing is not just about getting rid of emotional wounds, but about creating a completely new paradigm of existence. This becomes possible only when we give ourselves the right to put our own interests first, recognizing that our well-being is no less important than the well-being of others. By making the decision to prioritize our own healing, we discover that deep within our being, there has always been a part of us that has longed for this moment. This part, which has been suppressed for years by external demands and the desire to conform, yearns to be heard. Remember how freely we expressed ourselves as children, without fear of judgment, without thinking about the opinions of others, when we laughed, played, and dreamed. But at some point in our lives, we learned to suppress this inner voice, to hide our emotions so as not to inconvenience others. We got used to settling for less than we deserve, convincing ourselves that it was normal. We stayed in situations that caused pain because the fear of change seemed even more frightening than the suffering. And so, in the process of healing, this forgotten part of us regains its voice. At first, it speaks timidly, as if not believing that it will be heard. It whispers warning when we are about to agree to something we don't want. It screams in our chest when we find ourselves in situations that don't align with our new values. It prompts us, for the first time in a long time, to ask ourselves, what do I really want? This question can be frightening because by asking it, we realize that for years we have been living someone else's life, making decisions based on the desire for external approval, the fear of being rejected, and the need to meet expectations that were never ours. Confronting this reality can be painful. It hurts to realize how long we have neglected ourselves, how much time we have spent maintaining relationships that didn't nourish us, and how we have betrayed our own needs out of fear of disappointing others. However, in this revelation lies a liberating potential. It gives us the opportunity to make conscious choices, the chance to abandon actions dictated by duty, and to follow the dictates of sincere desire. We are free to revise our beliefs, say goodbye to what weighs us down, and discover new horizons in life. We have the power to learn to listen to our inner voice with love, to acknowledge our emotions, and to surround ourselves with the care that we used to give to others. And when we begin this journey, something amazing happens. We realize that self-love is not just about making important decisions in our favor, setting boundaries, or getting rid of toxic relationships. It manifests itself in everyday things, in how we greet a new day, in the words we say to ourselves when we look in the mirror, in the ability to allow ourselves to rest without feeling guilty. Emotional healing is not only an internal process, it is reflected in everything we do, in choosing healthy food, in music that lifts our spirits, in knowing when to stop and give ourselves a break. Here, the wise advice of Louise comes into play. Our relationship with ourselves forms the foundation of all other relationships. If we love ourselves, we attract love. If we respect ourselves, we will be respected. If we are comfortable in our own company, we will stop seeking approval from those who don't appreciate us. But don't expect this path to be strewn with roses. We will have to face a version of ourselves that is still bound by fear, that is afraid of being rejected if it changes too much, that seeks confirmation of its worth in the external world, and that clings to destructive patterns of behavior because it knows nothing else. It is at this stage that many fail, because in the face of fear, the temptation arises to return to the cozy comfort zone, continuing to ignore deep-seated problems. However, if we sincerely strive for mental health, running away from ourselves is not the answer. It is necessary to listen to the inner voice, to ask a direct question. What are you really afraid of? Loneliness? Inadequacy? The judgment of others for taking care of yourself? Acknowledging these fears triggers a process of transformation. We realize that fear is not our essence, that we can experience it and move forward at the same time. The life we dream of is not beyond fear, but within ourselves. This leads to a key realization. Healing is not about getting rid of fear, pain, and sadness forever. This is the ability to support oneself in difficult moments, to be that reliable refuge that we have been fruitlessly seeking in others. It is the capacity to treat oneself with compassion, even when making mistakes, understanding that we are in a process of continuous development, and each day dedicated to self-care is already a victory. But a natural question arises. Does the ability to put oneself first mean that pain will never touch us again? Of course not. Disappointments await us, and there will be days when confidence in the correctness of the chosen path falters. But now we will have an understanding of how to cope with this pain. We will not ignore it, diminish it, or blame ourselves for its occurrence. We will observe it, feel it, and allow it to pass. Having learned to take care of ourselves, we will learn to protect our inner world, to distinguish what is within our control from what is beyond it. We will surround ourselves with people who energize us, not deplete us. We will create a life in which happiness does not depend on external circumstances, but on harmonious relationships with ourselves. At this fateful moment, a transformation takes place. The shackles of being a victim of circumstances fall away. The need for the approval of others as a source of self-worth disappears, and a life dictated by the expectations of others gives way to an existence based on personal truth. Having reached this pinnacle of self-awareness, a person transforms the world around them. One should not assume that reality becomes cloudless and problems disappear forever. The point is different. There is an unwavering confidence that despite any trials, we always have ourselves, a support and backing whose value is immeasurable.